In 1981, a young man from Ohio arrived in Virginia with dreams of planting a vineyard of his own. Now, over 40 years later, Jim Law has built a legacy of producing terroir-driven wines at Linden Vineyards. As he prepares for Harvest 2023, I sat down with Jim to discuss his philosophy of grape growing, the history of Linden, and what he sees for the future of winemaking in Virginia.
Well, I got to Virginia by reading a little classified ad in a trade journal called Eastern Grape Grower and Winemaker magazine. It's a mouthful. And it was once a month, and at the end there was a page of classified ads, and somebody in Virginia was wanting to expand their vineyards, start a winery, and looking for somebody to help them do that. At that time in Virginia, there was an operation called Rapidan, which was a German operation with a German winemaker, and there was Barbersville with an Italian operation. And I thought, well, they must know something we all don't know, so why did they invest here? And so I got a job. I got a job to start a small winery in the Shenandoah Valley and expand the vineyards, and I loved it. I fell in love with Virginia. The owner of this operation made his money in a quasi-theme park called Dinosaur Land. And he had built a house, and the apartment where he raised his family in back of Dinosaur Land was available for whoever was lucky enough to get the winemaking job. Once I came to Virginia, I found I loved this area and wanted to be here. But I needed to be at a high elevation, given the style of wine that I wanted to make, which is crisper with more acidity, more minerality. So I started looking every weekend. I had a chance, topo maps, and going around with real estate agents, knocking on doors, whatever it took. And it was frustrating because there's a lot of good sites in Virginia, but either they're not available for sale or they're too small or too big. So eventually I landed on this place. When I chose this site, the only thing we really understood at that time, we meaning as the industry, is that we needed well-drained soils. And that holds true. If you don't have good drainage, the vines usually die. And this is well-drained soil, but what we didn't understand is the importance and depth of soil-vine relationship, and that not all soils are created equally, and some hold a lot of water. Even if they're well-drained, they still have a lot of water. Those are more deeper clay-based soils. And then others are very droughty soils, so they lose their water quickly, and they don't have a lot of organic matter or clay to hold the moisture, so the vines can quickly get stressed out.
The first vines at Hardscrabble were planted in 1985, totaling 8 acres. In addition, heirloom apples and blueberries were planted to help support the vineyard with a pick-your-own operation. Construction on the winery building began and was completed in time for the 1987 harvest, Linden's first commercial vintage.
Our best vintages are average vintages, because that's what we plan for. Mark Twain has a quote that says, "Climate is what we plan for, weather is what we get." Well, when we plant a vineyard, we're planning for average. We're not saying, oh, in 1 year in 10 this will produce great wine, and the rest of the year not so much. No, in an average year, this will produce really good wine. And it made me realize that that's what it's all about, is doing your planting, choosing the right stock that will do really well in an average year. It's not about getting high production. We could double our production if I decided to take more crop. It'd be easy, but then you wouldn't like the wine, and that's what's driving us, to get good concentration. Same with inputs. Everything we do is by hand, and it's very meticulous. There's a lot of labor that goes into it, and if we didn't do that, again, the wine would lack finesse and concentration. So you have to, with time, learn about what's important and where you need to put your emphasis.
Winemaking is easy. The hard work is out there. And every year, in the 20 years I've been in the industry, this is shaping up to be an exceptional vintage. I've never seen a vintage like this. But that's 20 years.
The style of the wine is very different than what you'd get in a Mediterranean area. We get more freshness, more mineral, more sometimes some really nice herbal flavors that you can only get in a wetter, cloudier climate. We used to be apologetic for that, especially when the wine critics like Robert Parker wanted big, massive, fruit-driven wines, because we don't do that. But now, as sommeliers prefer wines with more finesse and more food-friendly, we're in a sweet spot. So it's all a matter of the challenges can become advantages, and that's the way you have to look at all of this.
One thing that drew Jim to Virginia was the opportunity to become what he calls a terroir pioneer, meaning he would be planting in a virgin wine region and discovering the possibilities it held. Over the next 40 years, he learned how to adapt his vineyard to the mid-Atlantic climate and how to craft terroir-driven wines with a sense of place and finesse.
When I was growing up, white Burgundies were on the table. And it's because my dad became fascinated by terroir differences of Meursault and Puigny and Chablis. And so I kind of grew up with that. And I didn't even know it was Chardonnay grape. I just knew that it was these funny names that were villages and the wines were different. So fast forward to the 80s, and I was looking for a site where Chardonnay could grow well. That was my main. It's not that I wanted only to grow Chardonnay, but Chardonnay was very, very important to me. And hence the cooler, higher elevation to ripen Chardonnay in the sweet spot around equinox, which is when the nights get cool and the days stay warm. So everything was centered around Chardonnay. And the Chardonnay grape has done exceptionally well here. We're still fine-tuning the style. That's why we do several bottlings and trying to figure out exactly where our best sites are. The old vines tend to make exactly the kind of wines I want. The young vines are still getting there, but they will eventually. So for the whites, it's about Chardonnay. The hardest decisions have been my best decisions, and that's to pull out vineyards. I often brag I've pulled out more vineyards than most people in Virginia have planted, because when you recognize you've not got it right, you need to remedy that, and the only way often is to remove a vineyard and start all over again. In our first planting, we gave it our best shot, but we planted Cabernet in places we shouldn't, and Merlot didn't do well, and it took a good 15 years plus to figure out why. And it wasn't until I started traveling to Bordeaux and talking to them, and it was so obvious. I wish I would have done that much earlier, to why we were having lack of success with many of our plantings. It's because we were putting them on the wrong soil. We know the vines, we know the vineyard blocks, we've been managing the same vineyard for years and years and years, making wine from it, and it becomes second nature. So starting about 25 years ago, I have a whole program of replanting most of the vineyard based on what I understood now about soils. And we finally finished. Actually, this planting here is about the last of those. It was planted in 2018. It's Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc. And it's just starting to produce now. And as the vines get older, it's going to be one of our best blocks. But before, it was producing kind of mediocre wines. It was what I call an A site, meaning the site, the soils, the aspect was perfect, but it was a C planting. I didn't plant it correctly with the wrong varieties, wrong row direction. And I know that in order to get to that next level, I had to start all over again. For the reds, surprisingly, the Cabernet Sauvignon has been our top grape. And I say surprisingly because a lot of people in Virginia say you can't ripen Cabernet Sauvignon, but I couldn't ripen Cabernet Sauvignon when I had it on the wrong soil, the clay-based soils. Once I put it on the granite soils, it ripens beautifully. And that is the key. I only have about 7 acres of granite soil here, so anything that was on granite that wasn't Cabernet got pulled out so Cabernet could be on that place. So when one starts to grow grapes in a new region, there's no ancestors to show you the way, to show you the path, to learn from. So we have to wing it. And so what kind of spacing and trellising and rootstock is all just the wild, wild west. And we started with a system that was similar to what they were doing in California called the T-bar. And that worked fairly well, but the New Zealanders and Australian people started coming by, and we started reading about what they were doing, and they developed this system called the lyre system. And that's what we have behind. It's the shape like the musical instrument, the lyre. And the idea was to spread out the foliage, their little solar panels, and in high vigor sites, you would be able to get more sunlight into the canopy and get better ripening. And in fact, it did work. The wine quality was quite good. The vines were happy and balanced, except for what I didn't understand is that when vines get old, they start to naturally decline. They're not as youthful and vigorous, just like people. And eventually, the vines were struggling to fill up the canopy space allotted to them. So, and plus we found as we got older, it was a lot harder to manage this system because you might be able to see that a lot of the shoots are growing in the interior, which is not what you want. You want them all separate. So we have to get inside, crawl under the wires, cut it out, and then just keep working sometimes on our hands and knees to clean all this up. So the lyre system was very successful at first, but then we realized that we needed to do a simpler system and one more appropriate to older vines.
As harvest transitions into crush, the process of making the wines begins. The grapes are hand sorted and destemmed before Jonathan applies a series of presses to extract the juice. As Jim hands over the winemaking to Jonathan, I asked him to talk to me about the future of Linden and how he is coping with the challenges of climate change.
Yeah, climate change, I think we're starting to get an idea of what it's starting to look like here, and it's just starting an idea. And what we're seeing is different than a lot of the rest of the world. We are warming. Not as much, not as extreme as some places like Europe or the West Coast. What we are seeing is more water. Every growing region has their own challenges. Ours is water, meaning a lot of water in some cases. And so that can be in the form of rain. That can be a problem because if it's a very rainy season, you get very high vine growth, so it's a lot more work to keep the vines in check, and you can have more disease pressure, mildews and rots. To mitigate this, we're really looking into what's called our techniques of canopy management, how we can protect the vines against water and hail, which is the other thing I haven't mentioned that we're starting to see an increase of. So if we have more leaves, they're shading the fruit, protecting them somewhat from hail. If it's a big hailstorm, it doesn't matter, but we get a lot of small hailstorms, so the leaves kind of protect the grapes from the hail. That helps a lot. We're also seeing more shading to the grapes, which is important. So we don't get too much direct sun, which heats up the grapes too much. But at the same time, we need good air circulation for drying. So we're using techniques where there's a lot of leaves up above the clusters, but inside the cluster of the fruit zone, there's more air circulation. So we're changing, just tweaking some of our growing techniques to accommodate the climate change in that way. I used to be apologetic to when I'd go to California, oh yeah, we get this rain, and they're like, oh my God, how do you do it? Now I'm understanding that might be our advantage. With climate change, we still have sufficient rain, whereas many of the areas of the world are struggling now for water. Climate change is changing things. Where it will change, how dramatically, we don't know. but we do know that we can't all of a sudden just plant 5 acres of some unknown variety and hope that it does well. So to mitigate the potential problems with climate change, we have what we call our climate change trial vineyard. And in that, at present, we have 22 different varieties. We'll be planting more.
But our whole criteria with these varieties, are they late ripening? Do they rot? Are they thick-skinned? That's where Virginia, in my opinion, the East Coast in general, that's where we need to be shifting our thought process.
But you have to plant them. You have to find out. We have to have more than just a couple years. I figure 10, 12 years before there's a consistency that's a known factor. So we're at about year 4 or 5 now.
A lot of Italian varieties, late ripening varieties, a lot from southern Italy like Fiano, Greco di Tufo. And then in the north, we have all 3 Valpolicella varieties. We have some Montepulciano di Abruzzo, some Aglianico. I love Aligote, speaking of Burgundy. They say it ripens slightly before Chardonnay, which we're probably asking for trouble, but it's a loose cluster. Another variety that's loose cluster and holds its acidity is Fiano. Luca at Barboursville sort of gave us a heads up on that. Luca and Daniele have been doing a wonderful job with Fiano for a number of years.
Climate change is impacting our vineyards, not in a positive way. And what I've come up with is sort of a 3-prong approach to what's happening. First is just reacting to what's happening, which is changes in management. The other is looking more long-term in terms of planting new varieties and sort of evaluating how they will do. And then the last is to reduce our own footprint, which if everybody did, we wouldn't have such a bad problem with climate change. So we put up some panels about 15 years ago for both hot water and electricity. It only covered about 20% of our needs. And then 3 or 4 years ago, I said, no, we need to cover 100%. So I looked at the possibilities and I came up with these what are called trackers, and they're 3 huge panels that move with the sun so they're maximum efficiently. And the reason for that is that we've sort of maxed out the roof, and if I just had regular panels, it would take up a lot of valuable vineyard space. And these 3 can do the same thing at much less land. So they actually follow the sun throughout the day. And it's kind of cool as you're working in the vineyard, you kind of almost know what time it is by looking at the panels. They're like sundials.
As the juice continues to flow from press to tank, I asked Jim to reflect on his passion for viticulture and his legacy of winemaking in Virginia. In an age filled with chaos and contradiction, Jim Law is an example of pure dedication to his craft and to his land, always willing to share what he has learned so future generations of winemakers can follow in his footsteps.
Well, what got me into this is what keeps me into it, and it's farming. Sometimes people don't understand that what we do is farming. It's just a specialized type of farming. But it's what as soon as I started working on farms back in the 70s, I realized this is what I wanted to do. And my goal was to make a living farming. And I wasn't sure at that time how that would happen, but that's what I'm doing, and that's what I will continue to do, and as I say, until I can't. But on top of that, you have another huge layer of the wine and of making better wine, but it's not so much about the cellar techniques. Our cellar techniques don't change very much. Sure, we learn and we tweak, but it's about the vineyard and what we can do in the vineyard to make better grapes, to make better wine. I guess what I want to show my colleagues and younger people coming up, that it isn't just science. In fact, you should lose the science over time, and it's more an art form. It's more about intuition, and it's more about palate training to make great wine. And so that's where it's important for me to emphasize, because I've had so many young winemakers come, and because they work for somebody else, so they have the pressure of making sure that they don't screw up. Yeah, because you can. If you take more risks, there's better chance you're going to mess up sometime. And economically, that can be very troublesome. So people are constantly playing it safe. You need to get this in the bottle safely so that you can sell it right away and then turn it over, get your cash flow. That's not how you make great wine. So these youngsters are to some degree handicapped because they're working for somebody else that needs cash flow. But I try to convince them that there are other approaches, at least, so maybe at some point in their career they can let go of the making wine safely and by numbers and start making it by the seat of your pants, which usually makes the best wine. I do like teaching. I used to teach courses in viticulture and winemaking early on. And whenever there's a chance with somebody that is truly interested, I love to show them around. So we've had everything from harvest interns, which is just during the harvest period, to 2-year apprentice programs, to just sort of one day pick your brain and learn.
Jim's impact, again, his writings were highly influential on me, but he's also the whole idea behind it. We don't do the apprenticeship program anymore, but the idea behind it was that Jim was getting very frustrated with the industry, and he's like, well, let's bring people here, train them, and send them out. Joshua Grainer at RDV was a former apprentice. Rucker DeVink was a former apprentice. Dominic Fiorese, who now has Crimson Lane in Linden, Virginia, was a former apprentice.
2 days ago, we were over at a neighbor's vineyard called Capstone, and just wanted to see what his vineyard, what he was doing, and he's been over here many times. Yesterday I was over at RDV, and I was tasting with one of their consultants and learning about, their Bordeaux style wines. And tomorrow or the next day we're going over to another Virginia or Linden vineyard and checking them out. We get together, we taste. I started an apprentice program years ago where many of these people I just mentioned had worked and learned from here. And a lot of it comes back, it's just the nature of agriculture, of farming, to share. It's a truly unique thing, and especially in the wine business. I can go and I can send emails and say, hey, in August of this coming year, I'm going to be in your region. I really like your wines. I'd love to come and visit and talk to you, especially about the vineyard. Can you receive me on either Thursday or Friday, August, whatever? And invariably we'll get an email back, we'd love to see you. And for 20 years, I've been making those kind of trips all over Europe and the West Coast. And they share everything, as we do when we have visitors. And it's because there's no trade secrets. They know you cannot replicate what they do because of terroir. They have a unique terroir, their wines are going to be unique, and it doesn't matter if you do exactly what they do, it's not going to be the same wine. I think we're still figuring out what we do very well, meaning the state of Virginia. One of the things we have to realize that Virginia is a political entity. It's not an appellation contrôlée, it's not an AVA. And so what Charlottesville does might be very appropriate to Charlottesville, but it's not appropriate to the mountains of Northern Virginia, and vice versa. So in a way, Virginia is cohesive, but I think that we have to look at it more in smaller regional pieces. People often, they say, well, what's Virginia's grape? And I say, well, you tell me what France's grape is, and I'll tell you what Virginia's grape is. It's too diverse. And I think that's almost a mistake. It's good for marketing, it's good for cohesiveness, but we're really more regional entities. That's why I sort of hang out with wine growers right in this small area rather than in a broader area. When I came here in 1981, it was what was referred to as a bucket and funnel industry, and we really had no idea what we were doing. The first meeting of our estate association was held under one oak tree at Shenandoah Vineyards with a couple picnic tables, so that sort of sets the scene. And the wines were not very good. But we were trying, we thought they were pretty good. So by developing a palate, and then by also, the industry got big enough where it was starting to attract investment, and that investment was attracting more skilled winemakers, experienced, trained winemakers, that eventually we got over the hump of making not so serviceable wines, maybe even flawed wines, to serviceable good wines. But getting over that, the next hump, which is to make very expressive wines with character and terroir driven, I think is a lot more difficult because it requires the work being done in the vineyard and really good site selection. So that's what I'm starting to see a little bit of now, where people are selecting sites not just based on marketing location, but actually based on vineyard attributes. And as that starts and as those people learn their sites, we're going to see that next bump up.
I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I've enjoyed making it. Jim Law and his beautiful property, Linden Vineyards, are truly one of the cornerstones of the Virginia wine industry. His passion for farming this land and his willingness to share what he's learned certainly make him worthy of the moniker Terroir Pioneer. But it takes more than one man to make great wine. It takes a team of people dedicated to the same goal. And Jim has that with Sharia Venius, Richard Boisseau, and Jonathan Weber, his winemaker. You can taste their collaboration and the expression of this land in every bottle of wine from Linden Vineyards. I encourage you to schedule a visit and see for yourself. There's something unique about these wines, something distinctly Virginia, something distinctly Jim Law. Please be sure to like this video by clicking the thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe to this channel. If you want to be notified of new videos when they're posted, click the bell icon too. Thank you once again for watching. I'm Matthew Corrigan for Virginia Roots, Virginia Vines.